September 14, 1978, Cedar Falls, Iowa. When the Hartwell farmhouse burned to ash at dawn, neighbors whispered about Martha Hartwell's sudden disappearance 3 days earlier. Her stepson Danny claimed she'd run off with a traveling salesman, but Martha's wedding ring, found in the rubble, told a different story entirely. Martha Hartwell stood at the kitchen window, watching dust clouds rise from the gravel road as another pickup truck rumbled past their farmhouse. The spring of 1977 had brought more than just new life to the Iowa countryside. It had brought her a second chance at happiness. At 34, she'd never imagined herself married to a farmer, but Eugene Hartwell had swept her off her feet during a church social in Cedar Falls. The smell of fresh bread filled the kitchen as Martha pulled golden loaves from the oven, the same recipe her grandmother had used back in Nebraska. Eugene would be in from the field soon, and his 18-year-old son Danny would follow, both of them hungry and covered in the honest dirt of a day's work. She'd learned to set 3 plates instead of 2, learned to cook for growing men who worked from sunrise to sunset. Danny had been the challenge she'd anticipated. Losing his mother to cancer just 2 years earlier had left him suspicious of any woman trying to fill that void. Those first months, he'd barely spoken to her beyond polite nods and thank yous, but gradually, Martha's patient kindness had worn down his defenses. She never tried to be his mother, just a friend who happened to make the best apple pie in Grundy County. The turntable in the living room spun another Patsy Cline record, Crazy, drifting through the house like a gentle breeze. Martha hummed along as she set the table, smoothing the yellow checkered tablecloth she'd brought from her previous life. Everything felt right here, felt like home in a way her small apartment in town never had. When Eugene's boots echoed on the front porch, Martha's heart still quickened the way it had on their first date. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, his weathered face breaking into the smile that had convinced her to say yes to his proposal after just 4 months of courtship. "Something smells like heaven in here," he said, washing his hands at the kitchen sink. The evening light caught the silver threads in his brown hair, making him look distinguished rather than old. Danny appeared moments later, taller than his father now, and filling out with the muscle that came from throwing hay bales and wrestling cattle. At 19, he had his mother's gentle eyes, but his father's strong jaw. Martha noticed how the neighbors' daughters lingered after church, hoping to catch his attention. "Mrs. Hartwell," Danny said, hanging his work gloves on the peg by the door. He'd started calling her that instead of just Martha, a small sign of growing respect. "Just Martha's fine, honey," she reminded him, the same patient correction she'd been offering for months. "You're practically a grown man." The AM radio on the kitchen counter crackled with the evening farm report, commodity prices mixing with Loretta Lynn's Coal Miner's Daughter. Eugene turned up the volume during the weather forecast, rain coming tomorrow, good for the corn, but bad for finishing the hay. As they sat down to supper, Martha looked across the table at her new family. Eugene's calloused hand found hers during the blessing, and even Danny bowed his head respectfully. The farmhouse that had felt empty and sad when she'd first visited now hummed with life and laughter. Outside, the Iowa sunset painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, stretching endlessly over fields of corn and soybeans. Martha had never lived anywhere so quiet, so peaceful. The city noise she'd grown accustomed to had been replaced by the gentle sounds of cattle lowing and wind rustling through grain. "Best meal I've had all week," Eugene declared, cutting another slice of Martha's pot roast. "Don't know how I managed before you came along." Martha blushed at the compliment, but she knew he meant every word. The refrigerator was finally full, the house finally clean, the loneliness finally banished. She'd found her place in this small corner of Iowa, and everyone seemed to agree she belonged here. The people of Cedar Falls had welcomed her with typical Midwestern warmth. At church socials and community gatherings, the other farm wives had embraced her as one of their own. Mrs. Henderson from the next farm over had even shared her secret for perfect pie crust, the ultimate sign of acceptance in rural Iowa. As darkness settled over the farmhouse, Martha felt the deep satisfaction that came from a day well lived. Tomorrow would bring the same comfortable rhythm, coffee before dawn, breakfast for the men, tending her garden, preparing another hearty supper. It was the life she'd never dared to dream of, and it was absolutely perfect. The summer of 1978 arrived with a heat that seemed to press down on the Iowa countryside like a heavy blanket. Martha stood on the farmhouse porch, pitcher of sweet tea sweating in her hands as she watched Danny work in the pasture beyond the barn. At 19, he'd grown into his father's broad shoulders, but there was something different about him lately, the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. The ice clinked against the glass as she poured tea for both of them, condensation immediately beating on the mason jars in the humid air. Danny approached the porch with that easy gait that reminded her so much of Eugene, except where her husband moved with the steady purpose of middle age, Danny carried the restless energy of youth. "Thank you, Martha," he said, accepting the glass and drinking deeply. A drop of sweat traced down his temple, and Martha found herself watching its path before quickly looking away. When had she started noticing such things? The porch swing creaked as they sat together in the shade, the afternoon heat making even breathing feel like work. Danny's thigh brushed against hers as he settled beside her, and neither of them moved away. The touch was innocent enough, but something electric passed between them that had nothing to do with the summer heat. "Dad's working late in the south field again," Danny observed, his voice carrying an odd tension Martha couldn't quite identify. She nodded, suddenly aware of how alone they were, how often they'd been alone lately with Eugene's long days during harvest season. The isolation she'd once found peaceful now felt charged with an energy that made her pulse quicken in ways that had nothing to do with her husband. Their trips to town together had become more frequent as summer progressed. Eugene trusted Danny to drive Martha to the general store, to help carry her purchases, to handle the errands that took her away from the farm. What had started as practical necessity had evolved into something else entirely. Last Saturday evening, they'd driven to the Sunset Drive-In Theater to catch Grease, sharing a bucket of buttered popcorn while Olivia Newton-John sang about summer nights on the enormous screen. In the darkness of the car, their hands had touched, reaching for the same kernels, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. Martha had felt Danny's eyes on her profile during the romantic scenes, and she'd been ashamed to realize she liked the attention. The Bee Gees' "Stayin' Alive" had been playing on the radio during the drive home, and Danny had tapped the steering wheel in rhythm while Martha tried to ignore how handsome he looked in the dashboard lights. When he'd walked her to the front door that night, there had been a moment, just a breath of hesitation, when she'd thought he might try to kiss her goodnight. Now sitting on the porch swing with the summer heat pressing around them like a secret, Martha felt that same dangerous electricity in the air. Danny's work shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, revealing the hollow of his throat where perspiration gathered. She found herself imagining what it would feel like to press her lips there, and the thought shocked her into standing abruptly. "I should start supper," she announced, her voice higher than usual. Danny's hand caught her wrist gently, stopping her retreat. "Martha, wait." The touch of his calloused fingers on her skin sent a shock through her entire body. She looked down at their joined hands, at the wedding ring Eugene had placed there just over a year ago, and felt a wave of guilt wash over her. "Danny, we shouldn't." "Shouldn't what?" His voice was soft, but his grip on her wrist tightened slightly. "Shouldn't talk, shouldn't spend time together. You're the best thing that's happened to this family in years, Martha. The best thing that's happened to me." The way he said her name made her knees weak. This was Eugene's son, her stepson, barely older than her youngest sister. But when she looked into his eyes, she didn't see a boy anymore. She saw a man who looked at her the way Eugene used to before marriage and routine had settled into comfortable companionship. "Your father loves me," she whispered, but the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Does he?" Danny asked, standing now so they were face to face, so close she could smell the hay and summer sweat on his skin. "When's the last time he really looked at you, Martha? When's the last time he made you feel like you were more than just someone to cook his meals and keep his house?" The questions hit closer to the truth than Martha wanted to admit. Eugene was a good man, a kind husband, but their passion had faded into a comfortable routine. Their conversations centered around weather and farm business, their evenings spent in companionable silence rather than intimate connection. Danny's thumb traced across her pulse point, and she realized he could feel how fast her heart was racing. "I see you," he said simply, "really see you." The screen door banged in the evening breeze, and the sound broke whatever spell had been weaving itself around them. Martha pulled her hand free and stepped back, putting the safety of distance between them. "I need to start supper," she repeated, but her voice shook with the effort of pretending normalcy. Danny nodded slowly, understanding more than she'd said. "Of course, Dad will be hungry when he gets in." As Martha fled into the house, she could still feel the phantom warmth of Danny's touch on her wrist. The kitchen that had always been her sanctuary now felt like a prison, and she gripped the counter with both hands, trying to steady herself. Outside, she could hear Danny's boots on the gravel as he walked toward the barn, probably to help his father with the evening chores. The radio on the counter played Conway Twitty's "It's Only Make-Believe," and Martha had never heard more appropriate words in her life. She was playing make-believe, pretending this was just innocent stepmother-stepson affection. But the heat between them had nothing to do with the Iowa summer, and everything to do with desires that could destroy the only real family she'd ever known. September 10, 1978, dawned gray and humid, with the kind of oppressive heat that made tempers run short and patience wear thin. Martha had been avoiding Danny for weeks, finding excuses to stay busy whenever Eugene left them alone, but the tension in the farmhouse had grown thick as molasses. She was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard Eugene's truck rumble down the gravel drive earlier than usual. The sheets snapped in the warm breeze, carrying the scent of fabric softener and the distant smell of burning leaves from a neighbor's yard. Her hands stilled on the clothespins as she heard voices from the barn, first Eugene's steady baritone, then Danny's higher register rising in what sounded like an argument. The barn door stood half open, and Martha could see their silhouettes against the golden afternoon light that slanted through the hayloft window. Father and son stood face to face near the old farmall tractor, their body language tense and confrontational. "You think I don't see what's going on?" Eugene's voice carried across the barnyard, sharp with an anger Martha had never heard from him before. "You think I'm blind to the way you look at her?" Martha's breath caught in her throat. The wet sheet in her hands dropped back into the basket as she moved closer to the barn, drawn by the horrible fascination of discovery. "Dad, you don't understand," Danny started, but Eugene cut him off. "I understand plenty. She's my wife, Daniel, my wife, and you're my son, which makes this about as sick and wrong as anything I can imagine." The words hit Martha like physical blows. She pressed herself against the barn wall, hidden in the shadows, but close enough to hear every painful syllable. "You don't appreciate what you have," Danny shot back, his voice cracking with emotion. "When's the last time you told her she was beautiful? When's the last time you really talked to her about anything besides the weather and grain prices? That's what marriage is, son. It's not all moonlight and roses. It's partnership, commitment, working together to build something lasting. But you wouldn't know about that, would you? You're still thinking with your..." "Don't," Danny's voice dropped to a dangerous quiet. "Don't make this about that. This is about her being lonely, Dad. About her needing someone who sees her as more than just a housekeeper who shares your bed." The sound of Eugene's hand connecting with Danny's cheek cracked through the air like a gunshot. Martha clapped her own hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. "You will pack your things and be gone by morning," Eugene said, his voice deadly calm now. "And if you ever come near my wife again, if you so much as drive past this property, I'll have you arrested for harassment." "She's not your property," Danny replied, his voice thick with what sounded like tears. "She's a person with feelings and needs that you ignore." "Get out," Eugene repeated. "Get out before I do something we'll both regret." Martha heard Danny's boots on the barn floor, moving toward the door where she hid. Panic seized her. She couldn't let either of them find her here, couldn't let them know she'd heard the confrontation that had just destroyed their family. She ran toward the house, the laundry forgotten in the basket by the clothesline. Behind her, she heard the barn door slam and Eugene's truck roar to life. By the time she reached the kitchen, gravel was spraying as he tore out of the driveway, leaving Danny standing alone in the barnyard. Martha watched through the kitchen window as her stepson walked slowly toward the house. His left cheek bore the red mark of his father's hand, and his shoulders shook with suppressed emotion. When he entered the kitchen, their eyes met across the yellow formica table where they'd shared so many innocent meals. "He knows," Danny said simply. Martha nodded, unable to trust her voice. The weight of their secret, their stolen moments and forbidden glances suddenly felt crushing in the afternoon light. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Danny, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen." He crossed to her in 3 quick strides, gathering her into his arms with desperate intensity. "Don't apologize. Don't you dare apologize for being the only good thing in my life." His lips found hers, and Martha felt herself drowning in the kiss she'd been both dreading and craving for months. His mouth tasted of summer and youth and possibilities that could never be. When they finally broke apart, both of them were crying. "He'll divorce me," Martha said, the reality of their situation crashing down around her. "He'll throw me out with nothing." "Then come with me," Danny urged, his hands framing her face. "We'll go somewhere no one knows us, California maybe, or up to Minnesota. I've got some money saved, and I can find work anywhere." The fantasy was tempting, a new life, a fresh start, away from the judgmental eyes of Cedar Falls. But Martha was 34 years old, not 19. She couldn't run away like a teenager eloping to avoid consequences. "Danny, honey, listen to me. You're young. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't throw it away on a woman who's old enough to be your mother." "You're not old enough to be my mother," he said fiercely, "and age doesn't matter when you love someone." Love, the word hung between them like a promise and a threat. Martha knew she felt something for Danny, something powerful and confusing and completely inappropriate. But was it love, or just the thrill of being desired after months of feeling invisible in her own marriage? The rumble of Eugene's truck returning cut through their moment like a knife. Danny released her and stepped back, both of them frantically trying to compose themselves before the door opened. Eugene entered the kitchen like a storm cloud, his face dark with barely controlled fury. He looked from Martha to Danny and back again, taking in their flushed faces and the guilt written plainly in their postures. "I thought I told you to pack," he said to Danny, his voice eerily calm. "Dad, please, let's talk about this." "There's nothing to talk about. You have 1 hour to get your things and get off my property. After that, I call the sheriff." Danny looked at Martha one last time, his eyes pleading with her to say something, to choose him over the security of her marriage. But Martha couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't do anything but watch as the fragile happiness she'd built crumbled around her. When Danny finally left, taking nothing but a duffel bag and his mother's Bible, Eugene poured himself 3 fingers of whiskey and sat at the kitchen table without looking at his wife. "Pack your things too," he said quietly. "I'll drive you to the bus station in the morning." Martha felt her world collapse entirely. "Eugene, please, it wasn't, we never." "Don't lie to me, Martha. I may be a fool, but I'm not blind. I saw the way he looked at you, and I saw the way you looked back. That's not something you can take back." The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 6 o'clock, and Martha realized that in just a few hours, her entire life had been destroyed by feelings she should never have allowed to grow. The farmhouse that had been her haven now felt like a prison, and the man who had promised to love and protect her now looked at her like a stranger. Outside, the first fat drops of rain began to fall, pattering against the kitchen window like tears. September 11th dawned with the gray light of a hangover sky, clouds heavy with the promise of more rain. Martha stood at the kitchen sink, her packed suitcases by the front door like accusers, watching Eugene load feed sacks into his truck with methodical precision. Neither of them had slept, and breakfast sat untouched on the table between them like a funeral meal. The rotary phone on the kitchen wall remained silent, though Martha kept glancing at it as if expecting Danny to call. He'd driven away the night before in his rust-colored Camaro, disappearing into the Iowa darkness without so much as a backward glance. Part of her had hoped he might return, might fight for her, but the rational part knew Eugene would make good on his threat to call the sheriff. "Bus leaves at 10:15, Eugene said, not looking at her, as he entered the kitchen for his coffee. His voice carried the hollow tone of a man going through motions, checking items off a list that no one wanted to complete. Martha nodded, her throat too tight for words. The yellow kitchen that had been her sanctuary for over a year now felt like a museum of better times. The checkered tablecloth she'd brought from her old apartment, the ceramic roosters on the windowsill, the coffee cups with their familiar chips and stains, all of it would soon belong to someone else, or to no one at all. "Eugene," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "Nothing left to say, Martha. Some things can't be forgiven, can't be undone. You made your choice when you let that boy put his hands on you." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Martha wanted to defend herself, to explain that it had been just one kiss, just a moment of weakness that meant nothing compared to the life they'd built together. But the words felt hollow even in her own mind. The attraction had been building for months, and they both knew it. The morning stretched on with painful slowness. Martha finished packing her few belongings, clothes, photographs, the turntable Eugene had bought for their first Christmas together. Everything else would stay, the furniture, the dishes, the life she'd thought was permanent. At 34, she was starting over again, returning to a world of efficiency apartments and solitary dinners. Mrs. Henderson from the neighboring farm stopped by around 9, her face carefully neutral as she delivered fresh eggs and local gossip. Martha could see the questions in the older woman's eyes, the barely contained curiosity about why Eugene Hartwell's wife was suddenly leaving town with her suitcases packed. "Travel safe, dear," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice carefully pleasant. "These country roads can be treacherous when you're not used to them." The comment felt loaded with meaning, as if Mrs. Henderson suspected more than she was saying. In small towns, secrets had a way of becoming common knowledge faster than corn grew in August. Eugene loaded Martha's bags into his truck with mechanical efficiency, his face set in lines that aged him 10 years overnight. The rain had started again, a steady drizzle that matched the gray desolation of the morning. As they drove toward Cedar Falls, the farmhouse disappeared behind them in the rearview mirror, growing smaller and smaller until it was just another dot on the vast Iowa landscape. The bus station was little more than a bench outside Morton's Five and Dime, with a hand-painted sign that listed departure times for Des Moines and points beyond. Eugene bought her ticket without asking her destination, as if where she went no longer mattered to him. "Got family in Des Moines," he said, handing her the ticket. It wasn't a question. "My sister," Martha confirmed, though they both knew Helen lived in a cramped apartment and worked double shifts at the packing plant. It wasn't the kind of place that welcomed unexpected houseguests, but it was somewhere to start. The bus arrived with a hiss of air brakes and diesel exhaust, its sides streaked with road grime and bug splatter. The driver, a heavy-set man with tobacco-stained fingers, loaded Martha's suitcases with practiced indifference. She turned to say goodbye to Eugene, but he was already walking back to his truck, his shoulders hunched against the rain. Martha climbed aboard the bus and found a seat near the back, watching through the rain-streaked window as Cedar Falls receded into memory. The cornfields stretched endlessly on both sides of the highway, their green stalks heavy with the promise of harvest. In another month, Eugene would be combining those fields, working from dawn to dusk to bring in the crop they'd planned together. But she wouldn't be there to pack his thermos or have supper waiting when he came in exhausted and covered in chaff. The bus made good time on the empty highway, its wipers beating a steady rhythm against the windshield. Martha closed her eyes and tried to imagine her new life in Des Moines, tried to picture herself finding a job, making new friends, starting over in a city where no one knew her history. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Danny's face in the barn, saw the desperate love in his eyes when he'd kissed her in the kitchen. By the time the bus pulled into the Des Moines terminal, the rain had stopped and afternoon sunlight was breaking through the clouds in golden shafts. Martha gathered her purse and her courage, preparing to step off the bus and into whatever came next. She didn't look back as the bus pulled away, heading west toward Council Bluffs and destinations unknown. Back in Cedar Falls, Eugene returned to an empty farmhouse that echoed with the ghosts of better times. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that grew cold in his hands, staring at the chair where Martha used to sit while she planned their meals and their days. The silence was absolute, broken only by the tick of the grandfather clock and the occasional creak of settling wood. He'd done the right thing, he told himself. A man had to have his pride, had to draw lines that couldn't be crossed. But the house felt enormous and empty around him, and for the first time since his first wife's death, Eugene Hartwell was truly alone. The phone rang once that evening, just after dark, but when Eugene answered it, no one spoke. He listened to the silence on the other end for a long moment before hanging up, wondering if it had been Martha calling from Des Moines or Danny calling from wherever young men go when they've lost everything that mattered to them. Either way, Eugene didn't answer when the phone rang again an hour later. Some conversations were better left unfinished, some connections better left broken. The silence of his empty house was punishment enough for all of them. September 14th, 1978, arrived with a stillness that felt ominous, the kind of pre-dawn quiet that makes farmers check their barometers and scan the horizon for signs of trouble. Eugene Hartwell stood in his empty kitchen at 5:30 a.m., coffee growing cold in his hands as he stared out the window toward the barn where everything had changed 4 days earlier. The house felt different without Martha's presence, hollower somehow, as if her leaving had sucked the warmth out of the walls themselves. Her coffee cup still sat in the dish drainer where she'd left it on her final morning, and Eugene hadn't found the strength to put it away. The yellow kitchen that had once buzzed with life and conversation now felt like a mausoleum. He'd been moving through the days like a ghost, going through the motions of farm life, while his mind replayed the scene in the barn over and over. Maybe he'd been too harsh. Maybe Martha deserved another chance, some explanation for why she'd let Danny get so close. But every time he considered calling her sister's place in Des Moines, pride stopped him cold. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 5:45, and Eugene forced himself into motion. The cattle wouldn't feed themselves, and self-pity was a luxury he couldn't afford during harvest season. He pulled on his work boots and headed for the door, grabbing his jacket from the peg where Martha used to hang her sweaters. Outside, the September air carried the smoky scent of burning leaves and the rich smell of earth preparing for winter. The corn in the south field stood ready for combining, golden stalks heavy with grain that would pay the winter bills. Eugene had been planning to start the harvest this week, before his world had collapsed around him. The barn felt cavernous in the pre-dawn darkness, shadows dancing in the weak light of the single bulb Eugene had strung from the rafters. He'd avoided this space since the confrontation, but the cattle needed hay and his feelings were less important than their hunger. The farmall tractor sat where he'd left it, indifferent to the human drama that had played out around its red bulk. Eugene was filling the hay rack when he heard it, a sound that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The whoosh and crackle of flames taking hold, growing stronger with each second that passed. He dropped the pitchfork and ran toward the barn door, his heart hammering against his ribs. The farmhouse was on fire. Flames licked at the kitchen windows, and smoke poured from the gaps around the door frames. The fire had already taken hold with terrifying speed, fed by the dry wood and old paint that made rural houses such perfect kindling. Eugene ran toward the house, shouting Martha's name before remembering with sick relief that she was safe in Des Moines. His hands shook as he dialed the fire department from the rotary phone in the barn office, the numbers seeming to blur together in his panic. The dispatcher's voice sounded impossibly calm as she took his information and promised trucks were on the way. But Eugene knew they'd never make it in time. The nearest station was 15 miles away, and the old house was going up like tissue paper. The sound of approaching engines reached him just as the kitchen roof collapsed in a shower of sparks and burning debris. 3 volunteer fire trucks roared into the farmyard, their red lights painting the dawn sky in hellish colors. Men Eugene had known all his life jumped down from the trucks, unreeling hoses and shouting orders over the roar of the flames. Chief Morrison, a weathered man who'd fought fires for 30 years, took one look at the inferno and shook his head grimly. "She's a goner, Gene," he said, clapping Eugene on the shoulder. "Best we can do now is keep it from spreading to the barn." The firefighters worked with practiced efficiency, their hoses throwing streams of water that seemed pathetically inadequate against the fury of the flames. The house that had sheltered 3 generations of Hartwells crumbled before their eyes, decades of memories dissolving into smoke and ash. Danny appeared as if from nowhere, his Camaro sliding to a stop in the gravel drive with a spray of stones. He jumped out of the car and ran toward the burning house before Chief Morrison caught his arm. "There's nobody in there, son," the chief said firmly. "Your stepmama left town days ago. Your daddy's safe." Danny's face went white, then red, then white again as the implications sank in. He looked from the burning house to Eugene, his eyes wide with shock and something that might have been guilt. "How did it start?" Danny asked, his voice barely audible over the crackling flames. Eugene studied his son's face in the firelight, looking for answers to questions he didn't want to ask. "Don't know," he said finally. "Just came out of the barn and saw it burning." The CB radio in fire truck 1 crackled with static and voices as the dispatcher coordinated the response. Chief Morrison poured himself coffee from the thermos his wife had packed, the familiar ritual of fighting fires in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. By full daylight, only the stone foundation and the brick chimney remained standing. The fire had consumed everything else: furniture, photographs, Martha's turntable, the yellow tablecloth, the ceramic roosters from the windowsill. A lifetime of accumulated possessions reduced to ash and twisted metal. The investigators arrived with the sunrise, poking through the wreckage with cameras and measuring tapes. Eugene watched them work, answering their questions with the numb detachment of a man in shock. No, he hadn't smelled gas. No, the electrical hadn't been giving him problems. No, he couldn't think of any reason someone might want to burn down his house. It was Chief Morrison who found Martha's wedding ring. The gold band had survived the flames, though it was blackened and misshapen by the heat. Morrison held it up in his gloved hand, the metal catching the morning sunlight like an accusation. "Found it in what's left of the kitchen," the chief said quietly. "Figured you'd want it." Eugene took the ring with trembling fingers, feeling its weight like a stone in his palm. Martha had been wearing it when she left. He was certain of that. He remembered seeing it on her finger as she'd climbed aboard the bus. So how had it ended up in the ashes of their kitchen? "Gene," Chief Morrison's voice seemed to come from very far away. "You all right?" Eugene looked up from the ring to find both Morrison and Danny staring at him with expressions of concern and growing suspicion. The questions he'd been avoiding suddenly seemed unavoidable, hanging in the smoky air like judgment itself. "She was wearing this when she left," Eugene said slowly. "I saw it on her hand." Danny's face went very still, and Eugene saw something flicker in his son's eyes, knowledge, perhaps, or fear, or both. The boy who'd once looked at Martha with such desperate love now looked like he'd seen a ghost. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the smoke and revealing the full scope of the destruction. Where Eugene's home had stood for 60 years, only charred timbers and shattered dreams remained. And somewhere in that wreckage lay answers to questions that would haunt Cedar Falls for decades to come. October 1978 settled over Cedar Falls like a gray blanket, bringing with it the kind of persistent questions that small towns never quite let die. Detective Ray Morrison, Chief Morrison's younger brother and the county's only full-time investigator, had been working the Hartwell case for 6 weeks, and every lead had turned into a dead end as cold as the early morning frost. The manila folder on his desk had grown thick with photographs, witness statements, and forensic reports that told a story without providing an ending. Martha Hartwell had disappeared. Her house had burned down. Her wedding ring had been found in the ashes, and somewhere between those facts lay a truth that seemed determined to stay hidden. Morrison lit another lucky strike and spread the crime scene photos across his desk like a grim game of solitaire. The blackened remains of the kitchen, the collapsed roof timbers, the twisted metal of appliances that had been reduced to scrap. And there, circled in red marker, the spot where Martha's ring had been recovered. The blood evidence bothered him most. Luminol testing had revealed traces of blood in what remained of the kitchen, not enough to indicate a massive injury, but more than you'd expect from normal cooking accidents. The pattern suggested someone had tried to clean it up, but blood had a way of hiding in cracks and crevices that casual cleaning couldn't reach. Eugene's story never wavered. He'd put Martha on the bus to Des Moines on September 11th. Hadn't seen her since, hadn't heard from her since. The bus driver confirmed a woman matching Martha's description had bought a ticket and boarded, but the Des Moines terminal had no record of her arrival. Somewhere between Cedar Falls and the capital city, Martha Hartwell had vanished into thin air. Danny's alibi was shakier. He claimed to have been staying at a motel in Waterloo since the night of the confrontation, nursing his wounded pride and planning his next move. The desk clerk remembered him checking in, but couldn't pin down his comings and goings with any precision. Country motels in 1978 didn't keep the kind of detailed records that city hotels maintained. Morrison had driven to Des Moines himself, following Martha's trail through the Greyhound station and into the maze of boarding houses and cheap apartments where a woman with limited funds might try to start over. Martha's sister Helen lived in a cramped efficiency near the packing plant, but she swore she hadn't seen or heard from Martha since the wedding the year before. She was always proud, Helen had said, chain-smoking Salems in her tiny kitchen, too proud to come crawling to family when her fancy farm life fell apart. If Martha was in trouble, she'd have handled it herself. The encyclopedia salesman story that both Eugene and Danny mentioned turned out to be legitimate. A man named Robert Kelly had been working the rural routes around Cedar Falls in early September, selling the Britannica Junior set door-to-door. Morrison tracked him down to a motel in Ames, where Kelly produced detailed records of his sales calls and customer contacts. "I remember the Hartwell place," Kelly had told Morrison over coffee at a truck stop diner. "Pretty woman, seemed lonely, bought a set of the children's books even though there weren't any kids around, said she was planning for the future." Kelly's story checked out. He'd been nowhere near the Hartwell farm on September 11th, and his sales route was documented with receipts and appointment books. Another dead end in a case that seemed designed to frustrate investigation. The forensic team from Des Moines had combed through the ashes with fine-tooth precision, but fire was a merciless destroyer of evidence. What little they'd recovered, fragments of bone that might have been chicken from Sunday dinner, metal objects too twisted to identify, the wedding ring that raised more questions than it answered, told them nothing definitive about what had happened in the Hartwell kitchen. Morrison's typewriter clacked in the quiet of his office as he updated the case file, carbon paper ensuring copies for the state investigators who'd taken a passing interest in the disappearance. The keys stuck occasionally, requiring him to backspace and retype entire sentences. Modern police work still meant manual typewriters and handwritten notes, filing systems that depended on manila folders and string ties. The phone on his desk rang with increasing frequency as autumn deepened. Other cases demanded his attention: cattle theft, domestic disputes, the occasional drunk driver who'd wrapped his car around a telephone pole. But the Hartwell case haunted his quiet moments, filling the spaces between active investigations with unanswered questions. Eugene had moved into town after the fire, renting a small apartment above the hardware store, while insurance adjusters argued about coverage and cause. He'd aged visibly in the weeks since the fire, his weathered face carrying new lines of grief and confusion. When Morrison questioned him for the fourth time, Eugene's answers had the hollow ring of a man going through familiar motions. "I keep thinking she'll call," Eugene admitted, sitting in Morrison's office with his worn hands folded in his lap. "Keep thinking there's some explanation for that ring, some reason it ended up in the house after she'd already left." Morrison had seen that look before, the desperate hope of family members who couldn't accept that their loved ones might be gone forever. Eugene's faith in Martha's eventual return seemed genuine, but faith wasn't evidence, and hope wasn't proof of innocence. Danny had left town shortly after the fire, claiming he needed to find work away from the gossip and suspicious stares. His forwarding address was a post office box in Arizona, where he'd supposedly found employment on a ranch near Phoenix. The few letters he'd written to his father were postmarked correctly, but letters could be mailed by anyone, anywhere. Winter arrived early that year, coating Cedar Falls in snow that covered the blackened foundation of the Hartwell house like a clean white shroud. Morrison drove past the ruins occasionally, studying the site as if it might reveal secrets the investigators had missed. But snow-covered rubble looked peaceful, almost innocent, giving no hint of the violence that might have occurred there. The case officially went cold in March 1979, filed away in the basement of the courthouse, along with other unsolved mysteries that small-town police departments accumulated over the decades. Morrison kept a copy of the file in his desk drawer, pulling it out during slow periods to review the evidence one more time, hoping fresh eyes might spot the detail that had eluded him. Eugene remarried in the spring of 1979, a quiet ceremony at the Methodist Church with only immediate family in attendance. His new wife was a widow named Sarah Kendrick, a practical woman who'd moved to Cedar Falls from Minnesota after her first husband's death. She was nothing like Martha, older, grayer, more reserved, but she brought stability back to Eugene's life. The town eventually stopped talking about Martha Hartwell, her disappearance becoming just another tragedy in Cedar Falls' collective memory. New scandals replaced old ones, fresh gossip overshadowed yesterday's mysteries. But Detective Morrison never quite let go of the case, never stopped wondering what had really happened during those 3 missing days in September 1978. He retired in 1983 with the Hartwell file still in his desk drawer, its manila cover worn soft from handling. His replacement, a young detective named Johnson, listened politely to Morrison's theories about the case, but showed little interest in pursuing cold leads. The new generation of law enforcement had different priorities, more pressing concerns than decade-old disappearances. Morrison spent his retirement years tending a small garden and reading crime novels, but sometimes in the quiet of evening, he'd find himself thinking about Martha Hartwell's wedding ring, how it had survived the fire when everything else had been consumed, how it had ended up in the kitchen when she'd supposedly left town 3 days earlier, how some secrets seemed determined to stay buried, no matter how many people went looking for them. The truth was out there somewhere, Morrison knew. Truth always was. Sometimes it just took longer to surface than anyone expected, waiting for the right moment, the right technology, the right person to ask the right questions in the right way. Time had a way of revealing things that seemed impossible to solve, and Detective Ray Morrison went to his grave in 1995, believing that someday, somehow, the truth about Martha Hartwell would finally come to light. 1999 arrived in Cedar Falls with the strange mixture of excitement and uncertainty that marked the approaching millennium. Detective Sarah Chen had been working rural Iowa cases for 3 years, transferring from Des Moines after deciding she preferred the personal connection of small-town policing to the anonymous urgency of city crime. The basement of the Grundy County Courthouse had become her unofficial project during slow winter afternoons. Boxes of old case files lined the concrete walls like archaeological layers, each decade marked by changes in paperwork, photography, and investigative technique. Some files dated back to the 1940s, their manila folders brittle with age and tied with string that crumbled at the touch. Chen had volunteered to digitize the cold cases, part of a state initiative to bring rural law enforcement into the computer age. The process was tedious, scanning photographs, typing handwritten reports into database fields, learning to navigate software that seemed designed by people who'd never worked a crime scene. But every case deserved a second chance, and technology was offering opportunities that previous generations of investigators could never have imagined. The AFIS system, Automated Fingerprint Identification System, had finally reached Iowa's smaller counties, arriving with the fanfare of a government program that promised to solve decades of unsolved crimes. Chen had attended the training sessions in Des Moines, learning to operate equipment that could compare fingerprints against a national database in minutes rather than the weeks or months required by manual comparison. Detective Morrison's old case files fascinated Chen with their meticulous attention to detail. The man had been thorough, documenting every interview, photographing every piece of evidence, pursuing leads with the dogged persistence of someone who took unsolved cases personally. The Hartwell file was particularly thick, filled with crime scene photos that told a story of destruction and mystery. Martha Hartwell's disappearance had all the elements of a classic cold case: missing person, mysterious circumstances, physical evidence that raised more questions than it answered. Chen spread the original photographs across her desk, using a magnifying glass to examine details that might have been overlooked in 1978. The kitchen crime scene photos showed the systematic destruction that fire brought to a family home. Charred timbers, melted appliances, the accumulated possessions of a lifetime reduced to ash and twisted metal. But there, in one photograph marked Evidence Item 7, Chen spotted something that made her pulse quicken. The door handle. Morrison had photographed it from multiple angles, this piece of hardware that had somehow survived the flames that consumed everything around it. The metal was blackened but intact, and Chen could make out what appeared to be fingerprint impressions in the soot that coated its surface. She pulled Morrison's evidence log from the file, scanning the neat handwriting that documented every item recovered from the scene. Door handle, kitchen entrance, fingerprint impressions visible but unidentified, no match in existing files. Chen felt the familiar tingle that came with discovering overlooked evidence. In 1978, fingerprint comparison meant manually searching through filing cabinets full of paper cards, a process so time-consuming that many smaller departments simply didn't have the resources to pursue it. But AFIS could search millions of prints in minutes, comparing ridge patterns and minutiae with mathematical precision. The original evidence was stored in the courthouse basement, cardboard boxes marked with case numbers and dates. Chen found the Hartwell box wedged between a 1976 cattle rustling case and a 1980 armed robbery, its contents preserved in manila envelopes that smelled of dust and forgotten time. The door handle was wrapped in brown paper, its surface still bearing traces of the fingerprint powder Morrison had applied 21 years earlier. Chen photographed it from every angle, then carefully lifted several prints using modern techniques that were far more sophisticated than those available in the 1970s. The digitization process took most of an afternoon. Chen scanned the fingerprints at high resolution, then uploaded them to the AFIS database with growing anticipation. The computer churned through its comparison algorithms while she waited, the dial-up internet connection making soft electronic sounds that seemed to echo in the quiet basement. The match came back in less than 10 minutes. Danny Hartwell, Dob. 3/15/1959, last known address, Phoenix, Arizona, arrested 7/23/1995 for driving under the influence, Maricopa County, fingerprints on file. Chen stared at the computer screen, her coffee growing cold in its styrofoam cup as the implications sank in. Danny Hartwell's fingerprints were on the kitchen door handle of a house that had burned down 3 days after his stepmother had supposedly left town. The same stepmother who was still missing after 21 years. She pulled Danny's arrest record from the Arizona database, studying the booking photo of a man who'd aged badly since his teenage years in Iowa. The boy who'd been 19 in 1978 was now 40, his face carrying the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades working outdoor jobs under the desert sun. His arrest had been routine, a DUI stop after he'd wrapped his pickup truck around a saguaro cactus outside Scottsdale. Chen reached for the phone, then hesitated. After 21 years, phone calls needed to be handled carefully. Evidence needed to be preserved, legal procedures followed, jurisdictions coordinated. The technology that had made this breakthrough possible was only as good as the investigation that followed it up. She thought about Detective Morrison, who'd spent 5 years pursuing leads that went nowhere, who'd retired without solving the case that had haunted his career. The AFIS system that could have cracked this mystery in 1978 hadn't been invented until 1984, hadn't reached rural Iowa until the late 1990s. Timing, Chen reflected, was everything in police work. Windows 95 displayed its familiar desktop as Chen began typing her initial report, the computer's fan humming quietly in the courthouse basement. Outside, snow was beginning to fall on Cedar Falls, the same kind of late winter storm that had covered the Hartwell house ruins 21 years earlier. But this time, the snow would fall on answers instead of questions, on resolution instead of mystery. Martha Hartwell had been missing for 7,670 days, but Detective Sarah Chen finally had a lead that might bring her home. The Arizona sun was brutal even in March, beating down on the Phoenix Police Department parking lot with the kind of intensity that made Danny Hartwell grateful for the air conditioning inside the building. At 40, he carried himself with the careful movements of a man whose body had been worn down by 2 decades of manual labor. Roofing, construction, ranch work, whatever paid enough to keep him fed and housed in the anonymous sprawl of the Southwest. Detective Sarah Chen had flown in from Iowa the previous day, coordinating with Phoenix PD to arrange the interview. Danny had agreed to come in voluntarily after Chen's phone call, though his voice had carried the hollow resignation of someone who'd been expecting this conversation for 21 years. The interview room was standard-issue institutional, beige walls, fluorescent lighting, a metal table scarred by years of cigarette burns and nervous scratching. Chen set up her cassette recorder with careful precision, testing the microphone levels while Danny sat across from her with his hands folded in his lap like a penitent in church. "You understand you're not under arrest," Chen began, following the script that protected both suspect and investigator. "You're free to leave at any time, free to request an attorney. Do you understand these rights?" Danny nodded, then remembered the tape recorder. "Yes, I understand." Chen opened the Hartwell file, spreading the photographs across the table like cards in a deadly game of solitaire. The door handle, blackened but intact. The AFIS comparison showing Danny's fingerprints clear as day. The crime scene photos that documented the destruction of what had once been his father's home. "Your fingerprints were on this door handle," Chen said simply. "The kitchen door of your father's house. The house that burned down on September 14th, 1978. Danny stared at the photographs for a long moment, his weathered hands trembling slightly in the fluorescent light. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I wondered when someone would figure that out." Chen felt her pulse quicken but kept her expression neutral. After 21 years, Martha Hartwell was about to come home. "Tell me what happened, Danny." The words came slowly at first, like water from a rusty pipe, then faster as the pressure of 2 decades finally found release. Danny talked about the confrontation with his father, about Martha's planned departure, about the 3 days that had eaten at his conscience like acid. "She didn't go to Des Moines," he said, his eyes focused on something beyond the interview room walls. "Never got on that bus. She came back to the house that evening after Dad threw me out, came back to get something she'd forgotten." Chen leaned forward slightly. What did she forget? Letters, love letters from her first husband, the one who died in Vietnam. She kept them in a jewelry box in the bedroom, and she didn't want to leave them behind when she started over. The detail felt authentic, the kind of small truth that guilty people used to anchor bigger lies. Chen made a note and waited for Danny to continue. "I was parked down the road, trying to work up the courage to apologize to Dad, maybe ask for another chance. I saw her car turn into the drive and followed her up to the house." Danny's voice cracked slightly, and he paused to compose himself before continuing. "She was surprised to see me, scared maybe. Said Dad would call the sheriff if he caught me on the property, but she let me in anyway, said we could talk while she got her things." Chen could picture the scene, the empty farmhouse, the young man and his stepmother, the weight of forbidden attraction and family destruction pressing down on them both. What happened in the kitchen, Danny? She was making coffee, going through the motions like everything was normal, but I could see she'd been crying, could see how much leaving was hurting her, and I got angry. Angry at Martha. Angry at the situation, angry at Dad for being so stubborn, angry at myself for letting it happen, angry at her for not fighting harder to keep our family together. Danny's hands clenched into fists. I told her she didn't have to go, told her we could figure something out if she'd just stay and talk to Dad. Chen waited, letting the silence draw more words from him. She said it was too late for that, said she'd made her choice and had to live with the consequences. But I could see she didn't really want to go, didn't really want to start over at 34 with nothing but a suitcase and a bus ticket. The confession was building momentum now, 21 years of guilt pouring out in the sterile interview room. Chen's cassette recorder captured every word, preserving the moment when a cold case finally turned hot. I grabbed her hands, tried to make her look at me, tried to make her see that running away wasn't the answer. But she pulled back, said she couldn't do this anymore, couldn't keep pretending that what happened between us was innocent. And then, Danny's face crumpled, decades of suppressed emotion finally breaking through. She turned away from me, walked toward the counter to pour her coffee, and I lost it. All the anger, all the frustration, all the guilt about destroying Dad's marriage, it just exploded. Chen held her breath, waiting for the words that would finally solve the Hartwell mystery. There was a cast iron skillet on the stove, one of those heavy ones Martha used for cornbread. I picked it up and, Danny's voice broke entirely. I hit her hard enough that she fell and didn't get up. The interview room fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the soft whir of the cassette recorder. Chen gave Danny time to collect himself before asking the question that would close the case. What did you do then? Checked for a pulse, tried to wake her up, but she was gone. There was blood on the floor, blood on my hands, blood on everything, and I panicked. Danny described the desperate hours that followed, wrapping Martha's body in an old tarp from the barn, loading her into his Camaro, driving through back roads, until he found a place to bury her in the woods behind the family's back 40. The physical labor of digging a grave in the September heat, the emotional weight of covering up his stepmother with Iowa soil. I thought if I could clean up the kitchen, make it look like she'd really left, no one would ever know what happened. But blood is hard to get rid of, even when you think you've scrubbed every trace away. Chen nodded, thinking about the luminol test that had revealed the blood traces Morrison had found in the ruins. Why did you burn the house? Dad was getting suspicious by the third day, started talking about driving to Des Moines to check on Martha, started asking questions about the encyclopedia salesman story. I realized he might search the property, might find where I'd buried her. Danny wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. So I went back to the house early that morning, poured gasoline around the kitchen, and lit it up. Figured the fire would destroy any evidence I'd missed and give Dad something else to think about. Your fingerprints on the door handle. I was in a hurry, scared out of my mind. Must have grabbed it without thinking when I left after setting the fire. Never occurred to me that fingerprints could survive flames. Chen looked at the broken man across the table, seeing not the monster she'd expected, but a 19-year-old boy who'd made a terrible mistake and spent 21 years paying for it. The Danny Hartwell who'd killed his stepmother in a moment of rage was gone, replaced by a middle-aged man whose life had been defined by guilt and regret. Where is Martha buried, Danny? He gave her precise directions to a grove of oak trees on the property that had once been the Hartwell farm, now subdivided into housing developments and strip malls. The grave was unmarked, forgotten, hidden beneath 2 decades of fallen leaves and urban sprawl. As Chen turned off the cassette recorder, she felt the satisfaction that came with closing a case that had haunted investigators for more than 2 decades. Martha Hartwell was coming home at last, and the truth that Detective Morrison had died wondering about was finally revealed. Justice would be served, but it would taste bitter for everyone involved. The Phoenix interview room had grown stuffy as the afternoon wore on, the air conditioning struggling against the desert heat that pressed against the building's windows. Danny Hartwell sat hunched over the metal table, his confession having drained 21 years of carefully maintained lies from his system. Detective Chen refilled her coffee from a thermos that had grown lukewarm, preparing for the second phase of questioning that would document every detail of the cover-up. "Tell me about the encyclopedia salesman story," Chen said, turning the cassette recorder back on after a 15-minute break. "How did you come up with that?" Danny rubbed his temples, the gesture of a man fighting a headache that had been building for decades. Robert Kelly had been to the house the week before, trying to sell Dad a set of children's books. Martha was polite to him, bought the junior set even though there weren't any kids around. She told him she was planning for the future. The irony wasn't lost on Chen. Martha planning for a future that would be cut short by the very person she'd been trying to build it with. After what happened in the kitchen, I needed a story that would explain why she'd left town. Kelly seemed perfect, a stranger, someone who'd shown interest in Martha, someone Dad wouldn't be able to track down easily. Danny described the careful construction of his lie, how he'd presented it to Eugene as reluctant truth, claiming Martha had been flirting with the salesman during his visit. The detail about her buying books for non-existent children became evidence of her dissatisfaction with farm life, her longing for something more than what the Hartwell family could provide. Dad wanted to believe it, Danny continued, his voice hollow with self-recrimination. Part of him, anyway. It was easier to think Martha had run off with another man than to admit their marriage had real problems, problems that maybe he could have fixed if he'd paid more attention. Chen studied the crime scene photographs spread across the table, seeing them now with the clarity that Danny's confession had provided. The blood traces Morrison had found made sense. Martha had fallen near the kitchen counter, bleeding from the head wound that had killed her. Danny's frantic cleaning had removed most of the evidence, but luminol had revealed the traces he'd missed in his panic. "Walk me through the 3 days after Martha died," Chen requested, day by day. September 11th had been the longest day of Danny's life. After burying Martha in the woods behind the farm, he'd returned to clean the kitchen with bleach and ammonia, scrubbing every surface until his hands were raw. He'd taken Martha's suitcase from her car and driven it to a truck stop outside Waterloo, leaving it in a dumpster where it would disappear into the waste stream without a trace. "I checked into the motel that night using cash, told the desk clerk I was looking for work in the area. Needed an alibi that would put me away from the farm, but not too far away to seem suspicious." September 12th had brought the first real test of his story. Eugene had called the motel, asking if Danny had heard from Martha, expressing worry that she hadn't contacted her sister in Des Moines. Danny had played his part perfectly, the concerned stepson who hoped Martha would come to her senses and return home. "I drove by the house that evening, parked on a back road where I could see the lights. Dad was moving around inside, probably looking through Martha's things, trying to understand why she'd left so suddenly. I almost went up to confess then, almost told him the truth." "Why didn't you?" "Because I was a coward. Because admitting what I'd done would have destroyed him completely, and I told myself I was protecting him by keeping quiet." September 13th had brought the crisis that led to the fire. Eugene had called the motel again, this time talking about driving to Des Moines himself, about contacting the police to file a missing person report. Danny had realized that official investigation would uncover the holes in his story, would eventually lead to questions he couldn't answer. "I went back to the farm early that morning, told Dad I wanted to help search for Martha. But I could see he was getting suspicious, could see him starting to wonder why I wasn't more worried about her disappearance." Eugene had mentioned searching the property, checking the old hunting cabin and the abandoned farm buildings where Martha might have hidden if she'd had second thoughts about leaving. Danny had realized with growing horror that a thorough search would eventually lead to the grove of oak trees where Martha lay buried in her unmarked grave. That's when I decided to burn the house. I waited until Dad went to town for supplies, then drove back to the farm with a gas can from the motel, poured gasoline around the kitchen, and lit it with matches from my pocket. Chen looked at the crime scene photos again, imagining the 19-year-old Danny moving through the familiar kitchen, systematically destroying the home where he'd grown up. The desperation required for such an act was almost incomprehensible, burning down your father's house to cover up the murder of his wife. You never considered confessing. Every day for 21 years, Danny replied, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Every time I saw a news story about a missing person, every time I called home and heard Dad's voice, every time I looked in a mirror and saw what I'd become. The psychological weight of carrying such a secret had clearly taken its toll. Danny looked far older than his 40 years, his face bearing the lines of a man who'd aged himself with guilt and regret. The carefree teenager who'd worked alongside his father in the Iowa cornfields was gone, replaced by a broken man who'd spent 2 decades running from consequences that finally caught up with him. The fingerprints on the door handle, you really didn't realize they'd survived the fire. Danny shook his head miserably. I was 19 years old, scared out of my mind, operating on pure panic. All I could think about was getting out of there before the fire spread to the rest of the house. I must have grabbed that handle without thinking, left my prints in the soot. Chen made notes about the forensic evidence, documentation that would be crucial for the prosecution. In 1978, partial fingerprints found at a fire scene might have been dismissed as inconclusive. But AFIS technology could match ridge patterns with mathematical precision, turning an overlooked clue into damning evidence. What about the wedding ring? Martha was wearing it when it happened. Must have come off when she fell, rolled under the counter or something. I was so focused on cleaning up the blood that I missed it completely. The ring had survived the fire that consumed everything around it, a small gold circle that had waited 21 years to tell its story. Detective Morrison had photographed it among the ashes, another piece of evidence that raised questions he couldn't answer with 1970s technology. As the interview wound down, Chen felt the mixture of satisfaction and sadness that came with closing a cold case. Martha Hartwell would finally receive justice, but that justice would destroy what remained of the Hartwell family. Eugene would learn that his son had murdered his wife, then burned down his home to cover up the crime. Some truths were more painful than the mysteries they replaced. Danny sat quietly as Chen gathered her evidence files, the weight of his confession seeming to age him further with each passing minute. After 21 years of running, he'd finally stopped, and the relief was almost as overwhelming as the guilt that had driven him west. What happens now? He asked as Chen prepared to leave. Extradition hearings, formal charges, a trial back in Iowa. You'll probably want to hire a lawyer. Danny nodded, understanding that his confession had set in motion a legal process that would define the rest of his life. But for the first time in 2 decades, he wasn't running from the truth anymore. And despite everything that lay ahead, that felt almost like freedom. The year 2000 arrived in Cedar Falls with Y2K fears that proved unfounded, and a sense that the new millennium might bring closure to old wounds. Danny Hartwell's extradition from Arizona had made front-page news in the local paper, reopening a case that most residents had filed away in their collective memory alongside other small-town tragedies that time was supposed to heal. The Grundy County Courthouse had seen its share of sensational trials over the decades, but the Hartwell case drew crowds that spilled out into the hallway and onto the courthouse steps. Reporters from Des Moines and Cedar Rapids set up cameras on the lawn, broadcasting live updates to audiences hungry for resolution to a mystery that had haunted rural Iowa for more than 2 decades. Eugene Hartwell sat in the front row of the courtroom gallery, his 70-year-old frame seeming to shrink with each day of testimony. The man who'd once filled doorways with his presence now looked fragile, diminished by the weight of learning that his son had murdered his wife and burned down his home to cover up the crime. His second wife, Sarah, sat beside him, her hand resting protectively on his arm, as if she could shield him from truths too painful to bear. Danny had aged visibly since his arrest, the desert tan fading to prison pallor during his months in the county jail awaiting trial. His public defender had negotiated a plea agreement, second-degree murder in exchange for a full confession and cooperation in locating Martha's remains. 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole in 2025 if he demonstrated genuine rehabilitation. Detective Sarah Chen testified about the AFIS technology that had cracked the case, explaining to the jury how fingerprint science had advanced since 1978, how computer databases could accomplish in minutes what would have taken investigators months to complete manually. The courtroom listened with fascination as she described the moment Danny's prints had matched the database, the phone calls to Arizona, the confession that had finally brought Martha home. The recovery of Martha's remains from the housing development that had been built over the old Hartwell property had required careful coordination between law enforcement and construction crews. 21 years of urban development had transformed the quiet grove of oak trees into a suburban neighborhood, but ground-penetrating radar had located the grave beneath someone's backyard swimming pool. Martha Hartwell's funeral had been held on a gray February morning, attended by people who remembered her from church socials and community gatherings. Her sister Helen had driven up from Des Moines, older and grayer, but still carrying the same defiant cigarette that had defined her during the original investigation. Eugene had sat in the front pew of the Methodist church, where he'd married Martha 23 years earlier, tears streaming down his weathered face as the minister spoke of forgiveness and eternal rest. The trial lasted 3 weeks, though the outcome was never really in doubt. Danny's confession had been thorough and consistent, his cooperation complete, his remorse genuine but insufficient to undo 2 decades of lies and cover-ups. When Judge Harrison sentenced him to 25 years in the Iowa State Penitentiary, Danny had stood straight and accepted his punishment without complaint. Detective Chen had watched from the gallery as bailiffs led Danny away, feeling the complex emotions that came with solving a case that had destroyed more lives than it had saved. Justice had been served, but it tasted bitter for everyone involved. Martha Hartwell was finally at rest, but her death had rippled through time to claim other casualties: Eugene's faith in his family, Danny's youth and freedom, the innocent assumption that small-town secrets stayed buried forever. In the months that followed, Chen often drove past the site where the Hartwell farmhouse had once stood. The foundation had been filled in and sodded over, leaving no trace of the tragedy that had unfolded there in 1978. A convenience store occupied the spot where Eugene's kitchen had been, its neon signs advertising lottery tickets and fountain drinks to customers who had no idea they were standing on ground soaked with blood and tears. The case had taught Chen about the persistence of truth, about how modern technology could reach across decades to illuminate secrets that seemed permanently hidden. AFIS had been invented in 1984, 6 years after Martha's murder, but it had taken another 15 years to reach rural Iowa departments with the resources to digitize old evidence. If the technology had been available in 1978, Danny would have been caught immediately, and 21 years of lies could have been avoided. Eugene Hartwell lived quietly in his apartment above the hardware store, his daily routine shaped by the careful rituals of a man trying to make sense of betrayal too profound for easy understanding. His son had murdered his wife, then comforted him during the investigation, had attended Martha's memorial service while knowing exactly where her body lay buried. The depth of Danny's deception went beyond crime into the realm of psychological cruelty. But Eugene also struggled with his own guilt, wondering if his stubbornness during the family crisis had contributed to the tragedy. If he'd been more understanding about Danny's infatuation with Martha, more willing to find a solution that didn't involve exile and ultimatums, might the violence have been avoided? The question haunted his quiet evenings, adding another layer of pain to grief that time seemed unable to heal. The farming community that had once rallied around the Hartwell family during their time of loss now watched Eugene with a mixture of sympathy and awkwardness. How do you console a man whose son has proven capable of such calculated evil? How do you process the revelation that someone you've known since childhood could sustain such an elaborate lie for more than 2 decades. Danny's letters from prison arrived sporadically, filled with apologies and regrets that Eugene couldn't bring himself to read completely. The young man who'd once worked beside him in the cornfields, who'd called him dad and sat at his dinner table, had become a stranger whose capacity for deception seemed bottomless. Some betrayals were too profound for forgiveness, some actions too final for reconciliation. Detective Chen kept a copy of the Hartwell file in her desk drawer, pulling it out occasionally to remind herself why cold cases mattered, why truth was worth pursuing even when it brought more pain than peace. Martha Hartwell had been dead for 21 years, but her story had finally been told completely. That was something, Chen reflected, even if it wasn't everything. The subdivisions that had replaced farmland around Cedar Falls continued to grow, bringing new families and fresh faces to a community that had once known everyone's business. The teenagers who now walked past the convenience store where the Hartwell kitchen had no connection to the tragedy that had defined their elders' understanding of how quickly happiness could turn to horror. But in quiet moments, in the spaces between daily concerns and routine obligations, the people of Cedar Falls still remembered Martha Hartwell and the lesson her death had taught about the price of secrets, the weight of lies, and the terrible consequences that could flow from a single moment of uncontrolled rage. Truth, they had learned, might be delayed, but was never truly defeated. It waited patiently in fingerprints and buried bones, in advanced technology and dedicated investigators, ready to surface when the time was finally right. Martha Hartwell was home at last, resting in the cemetery beside the Methodist church where she'd once sung hymns and planned church socials. Her gravestone bore a simple inscription, "Beloved wife and friend," but her real memorial was the justice that had finally been served, the truth that had finally been told, and the reminder that some stories refuse to stay buried forever.